As a race, like humans all together should work together, and at the same time, everyone should have independent thinking. So that, I think, would be a good structure to actually drive like improvements overall for the society. Here is a slide on what I think, why I'm very positive on the long term for the education space overall for China, because I think this chart pretty much summarizes it. Is there's about 18 million students who are at the age of around 18 each year, and only a small portion of them actually eventually got to undergraduate. So the second column is just showing that only a portion of them actually applied to take the Gaokao exam, because the rest of them probably decided to go into the job market and get a real job and make an income at an earlier age. But then a good portion still decide to take the Gaokao. By taking the Gaokao, they already kind of indicated preferences or the interest to actually pursue higher education. But then even with that, around 10 million students doing that, only less than half of them actually eventually got into a bachelor's degree program. So I think it's essentially showing the competitive landscape, how hard it is to get into a university in China, which I think is pretty much the driving reason behind the whole sector. Whether it's getting into a really good school, public school, or private school in general overall, or spending all these investment dollars into training, courses, additional education, technology tools, or any sort of experiential learning, overseas study tours, or even camping. So a lot of different products, I think, are basically driven by the strong demand for going to a top university eventually, so that everyone just kind of work backwards from there. So I think that's the main forces for China. But this is more of a short-term outlook, which I can also kind of go through a little bit. But with what happened in China, not too much from the book, but I think this is a little bit more of the near-term kind of view I have for the space. I think it's just all of a sudden everyone got pushed or encouraged to take the classes online. So that really shifted the education market from offline to online kind of almost overnight. Although, obviously prior to that, everyone was, all the players, all the education companies are already investing in trying to test the best method for online edtech. But I think the COVID-19 situation helped to shift the market. And eventually, I think that is positive, although some parents will probably have different feedback and feeling from staying a lot at home for a long time, teaching kids, trying to teach kids at least, while also working from home. So there's definitely goods and bads and areas that actually got for improvements and feeding back into the companies. So, but net, I think that's positive. But the longer term, I think in the book I actually discuss is reason why I'm quite positive overall, not just China, but overall for edtech is, I think, while China, as I mentioned in the earlier chart, is the competition is really driving the concerns, I guess, among a lot of the parents, the nervousness. Globally, I think it's a similar situation, which is driven by the change of the job market overall, the future of work, so to speak. This is a chart also with some data coming from consulting firm McKinsey, so expecting how the job market would evolve in the next kind of 10, 15 years. But eventually a lot of jobs will be lost, but a lot of them would be created as well. It's just a different types of jobs. But I think because a lot of the parents are getting affected now in their current daily job, and there's so much uncertainty that we don't know what the job market would be like for ourselves. And so it kind of fits also into like how they should plan or prepare the kids for the future. So that really how parents, I think, themselves are very nervous, and that makes them even more nervous for their kids because they don't know what to expect and how to prepare them. So that's really, I think, the fundamental force globally, kind of fitting into the education space. That's why I'm quite positive overall for the sector. And in the book, I also discuss a couple more trends overall for education. I think cross-age learning, which is already pretty much growing in the last 10 years or so globally, but not the dominant kind of mainstream. But I think different markets have exploring that. We're thinking in the classroom, which is getting outside, learning on the job. Interdisciplinary, I think it's more higher education at university level at the moment, but I think we're seeing that going down to lower levels. Internship have been a pretty much main component, I think, of university learning in the West, but I think it's getting more and more popular in the East as well. And apprenticeship, I think, is coming back overall for a lot of the industries, because a lot of the tedious kind of repetitive jobs will be replaced by robots. So then I think a lot more of the human value will be replicated and getting a lot more value now. So that's an area that I think that would come back. And of course, lifelong learning is a function or a derivative of what's happening with the future of work, with industries getting disrupted. The last point I thought is very interesting, but I think it's going to take quite a while to really be, I guess, turning and growing into more of a bigger element of higher education. But I think it's actually coming from one of the study in Stanford. But essentially, it's more of a social curriculum, mission-based learning. So essentially, it means rather than learning philosophy or history or economics, the younger generations will probably want to address problems, fix whether it's water problem, plastic problem, climate issue, or like these bigger global problems. I think the curriculum should really be preparing students to solve these problems, and instead of coming up with like, oh, you're supposed to major in like physics, but then you may also want to learn about a lot more different subjects to actually help you solve the problem. So it's going to be more of a problem-based curriculum rather than the kind of subject-based. So I think that's very interesting. I hope to see a lot more schools actually trying to do that. I think now we're seeing some schools doing that's more of a certificate program, but hopefully that will eventually and over time turn into more of the core academic curriculum. And I thought, lastly, in the book, I thought that's quite interesting. I highlighted throughout the book, not specifically, there's a chapter in it, but throughout the book, I tried to highlight equality as an issue. Overall, I think from an educational access point of view, or what sort of education resources you can get, to the benefits of EdTech. With EdTech rising, I think I can see that that's one tool that whether it's the government or laterally, as we evolve going through the technology environment, how EdTech can potentially solve the equality issue by providing or lowering the cost of quality education overall. So I think one classic classic example I would usually give is in China. I think the main demand for EdTech is because in lower level cities you don't have the good quality teachers. Usually the best teachers are in top tier cities, and they gain a lot more resources. So I think in the lower tier cities, the students really appreciate the access. So that's why EdTech is taking off. I think in China, because of the geographic situation or this kind of disperse of quality resources. And I think that is an potentially an area or angle to help with equality, and another, not exactly intentional, but I think it's eventually will play out is the future of work as the repetitive portion of the daily tasks of a lot of careers would be replaced by robots, and the human value part would come back again, or human element. And usually a lot of the careers, a lot of the jobs with a stronger human element tend to be a bit more female heavy-weighted. So I think that might help with the gender equality as well. So that's kind of a side benefits, I think. So throughout the book, I have some discussion on that.
In 10, 20 years, when the students are going through Gaokao or their undergraduate or graduate degrees, the jobs that they're going to be entering to don't exist yet today. So there's no way we can prepare them for it because we don't even know what those jobs would be. But, the other point that you had about the mission-based learning, the problems of the world will never go away. So from that perspective, we can get our kids ready to start thinking about their futures. Are there certain mission-based topics that you'd like to highlight, for kids in China or around the world to be thinking a bit more about?
Well, I think sustainability, right? So sustainable like living, like how are we going to live and develop and keep the economy growing, right? And like pursue economic development in a sustainable way, right? Without using up all our fossil fuels, without like kind of creating so much pollution that we have all these issues with air, the issues with water. I think it's just we think I'm not like particularly like inclined to say, well, we're going to solve the water problem or the climate problem, but I think it's just overall how we're going to feed everyone to, right? The food problem, right? There's some like all sorts of new types of meats, right? The animal, like how we're going to farm enough animals to really feed a huge population, right? Or growing population globally. So I think it's overall as for humans as a race to kind of come up with this solution. So I think that would be a mission overall to continue to grow economically and also enhance our quality of living, but without destroying for the future generations.
Financial investor perspective, what are some of the things that you think other investors around the world should know about investing in education in China, in Asia, and into the future?
I think the big question really is regulation, right? So it's a little bit going back to an earlier comment about, how come that we can actually invest in a private school in China? It doesn't seem to be that common in other markets. Like most people haven't really heard of that, especially in the West, right? Kindergartens, maybe you have private kindergartens or childcare centers, but like investing in a private high school, that sounds a little bit weird. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the regulation part, whether it's China and other markets, because I think it's definitely an industry that is highly regulated across the board for a lot of governments. So I think this area requires quite a bit of work. For China specifically, it's changing all the time. So I think every 2-3 years in the past 10 years, every 2-3 years we see a bit more enhancements and refining of the regulation rules. So the government continues to try to work on that. Of course, I think the bigger goal from a lot of the regulations are basically also addressing the equality issue that I was trying to talk about. So how do you use regulations to prevent people from, for example, monopolizing a certain segment, for example, like primary school in a particular city. So how do we prevent like all these big companies to dominate and make it really hard for children coming from underprivileged families, right? So a lot of the regulations, I think, in China are designed from that reason, though a lot of the logic goes back to equality. But it's just such a new segment that I think, on the one hand, the government is trying to open it up so more private capital can go in and accelerate the development of the industry. But on the other hand, because all this private capital is going in, we also don't want any sort of monopoly to make it very hard, because at the end of the day, it's still a social good, right? It's still education. The bigger goal is to have everyone having access to a quality education. So I think that balance that's making it pretty tricky for governments and the central government and the local government in China to come up with a structure, a framework that keeps the bad players out of the game, but at the same time encourage all this good capital to go in and help accelerate the development. I think it would be similar in other markets as well. So different markets we have seen, for example, like Korea and Japan are also quite big in culturally, like Asia also very big into education investments or spending overall. It's a big market, but how do you regulate that to make sure the culture is healthy? Like students are not overstressed and to the point that it's really learning and it's really an education. It's not just a test, an exam, and getting an A in the exam.
Absolutely. I think too many of our kids have spent more than 2 decades just being really stressed out, trying to get information into their heads. And, now I spend a lot of time thinking about, how do we educate, our kids to know things that a computer wouldn't be able to learn? Could you tell us a little bit more about, from a financial investor perspective, what are some of the buckets in education that you think other investors should start thinking about investing in for the next 5, 10, even 20 years?
Well, I think there are the training segment. I think there are a few areas, right? One theme I would probably say is lifelong learning, or also related to the future of work. Is essentially people who are in the job, like adults in the job. Their jobs may get disrupted, they might disappear, and we need to retrain ourselves, right? Gain new skills and reposition ourselves in the job market to go into a new industry, which we don't even know now, right? Possibly. Maybe it's coming in the next 5-10 years. So I think the kind of retraining market or professional training market for adults should be quite attractive, I think, in the next kind of 10-15 years globally, because I think a lot of jobs will just get disrupted, but there will be new jobs getting created. So we just need to prepare ourselves and get retrained to fit into those new jobs. So that's one market. And then the other, I think, is just overall going into that education system for K-12. I think K-12 it continues to be an attractive segment, partially because I think, as I mentioned, competition is a big thing for China and globally, but then for China and other Asian markets, probably Southeast Asian markets like Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, these markets have huge population and the average income level definitely growing quite rapidly. So that's, and also the cultural appetite to invest in education as income grows. I think that would make it a very attractive segment. Of course, regulations would be a bit of a investment risk factor throughout, but I think mostly that fundamental positive drivers are still there. So for K-12, I think overall it is attractive. That tends to be the case. There'll be a little bit more lenient with regulations on the training side. So with training courses for K-12, whether it's, well, at this point, we know that art classes, piano classes, language classes, like English preparation courses for different types of exams, and programming classes. Those are quite popular, I think, in K-12 as a segment. Depends on the market that we're in China, of course, then you can also invest in K-12 public schools. So there are quite a number of listed players in the market in both Hong Kong and US for private K-12 schools to get that sort of exposure. So I think that's another theme that I'm seeing as an interesting theme, but that's a bit more exposed to regulation for when it comes to schools, a little bit less when it comes to training companies. Another theme which we haven't really seen much in either both private or public side is just the overall broader kind of learning, like whether it's traveling and learning on the and sightseeing and that type of tours and experiential learning. We haven't really seen a really big company in that area that could be kind of investable. So it's, here and there is a very fragmented market, but I think that area is interesting.
If you had to use like 3 words to describe education or the potential of education in China, what would the 3 words be?
Resilience. I think it's highly resilient. I think, necessity. I think it's a necessity that people are constantly investing, and I think for hope, it is, in a sense, in the longer term, it is a way that people are investing. There's a lot of expectations and hope building into that. Education is, I think culturally, people use that as a way to buy into their dreams.
Look into the future and see someone who was just born today, 20 years from now. What's your hope for them?
I'm hoping that they would be independently thinking. They were getting an education that actually trained them to do critical thinking, right? It's not just like, basically book smart, right? Just learning to take exams, like being a kind of exam machine, right? So I think, because nowadays, basically, we can easily find out any answers and solutions like on our phones, right? So our phone basically serves as a huge dictionary or library. In a more traditional sense, but I think the critical thinking and understanding and analyzing situations would be the main skill set for the newer generation. Hopefully, I think that everyone could have that independent thinking skill set, and at the same time embracing and working together to solve problems, like whether it's called technically mission-based learning or just social curriculum, whatever we call it. I think as a race, like humans all together should work together, and at the same time, everyone should have independent thinking. So that, I think, would be a good structure to actually drive like improvements overall for the society.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for your sharing today. Can't wait to share your book with more of my friends and our community. And we look forward to your next books as you invest in more EdTech down the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica.